Is this John or Maria Magdalene? Is a very easy question, but it's a stupid question, because it must be John.
Asked to have an image of Christ.
Touched the face of Christ and then bore a miraculous image.
Institute of Learning comes about. Now we know that Leonardo da Vinci...
In Florence, the great city of Renaissance Italy, the Platonic Academy, a place of intellectual thought and philosophy, was undergoing a revival. As the world awakened to the possibilities of new knowledge, the Academy was transformed into a hub of learning, a sanctuary where thinkers and artists alike could come together to explore the boundaries of knowledge. The likes of Plato and Aristotle were resurrected through the studies of humanism, and the minds of the time sought to reshape society through reason, art, and science. But despite this resurgence of intellectual growth, one towering figure was conspicuously absent from this transformative moment. Leonardo da Vinci, a name that would later echo through the halls of history, was excluded from this very institution. Why? What was it about Leonardo's genius that led to his exclusion? It's almost inconceivable Leonardo da Vinci, who was a polymath in every sense of the word, whose work spanned art, science, anatomy, and engineering, was denied entry to the very academy that was supposed to celebrate the growth of the mind. Perhaps it was his refusal to adhere to the traditional doctrines of the day, his relentless questioning of authority, or his revolutionary approach to both art and science that made the intellectual elite uncomfortable. Leonardo was not the conventional artist or scientist. His work strayed far from the established norms, and his refusal to conform made him a threat to the status quo. He questioned everything from the way we perceive the human body to the nature of the universe itself. His innovations in perspective, anatomy, and mechanics were centuries ahead of their time. To think that someone who contributed so much to the foundation of modern knowledge could be excluded is both tragic and revealing. It speaks to the fear that his ideas, if fully understood, would undermine the authority of those who controlled knowledge and power in his time. This tension between Leonardo and the established institutions would continue throughout his career, and it is reflected in his most famous work, The Last Supper, where hidden messages and symbols would speak to a deeper, far more radical philosophy that he could not express openly. For over 500 years, The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci has captivated audiences. It has been the subject of admiration, religious reverence, and countless scholarly analyses. The story of Christ's final meal before his crucifixion has been examined and interpreted from every angle imaginable. The vibrant depiction of Christ and his 12 disciples, seated at the table in a moment frozen in time, is among the most iconic images in the history of art. Yet, what if this image held a secret, a message so profound that it had been hidden for centuries, waiting for the right time and the right technology to uncover it? The Last Supper has been hiding something for centuries. Not a small hidden brushstroke, not an underdrawing that got lost in the restoration process. What Leonardo hid was far more radical. Actual words, full sentences written in his own handwriting, buried beneath layers of paint so deep that no human eye could detect them. These words were not accidental markings or sketches, they were deliberate, structured, and encoded, a message woven into the very fabric of the composition. The hidden text within the painting wasn't just an artistic detail or a forgotten fragment of a sketch. No, it was a message that, if Leonardo had dared to speak it aloud in 1497, would have likely cost him his life. For centuries, the painting had been admired for its composition, its use of perspective, and its theological significance. But what if these things were not the whole story? What if the message in The Last Supper was not only a work of religious devotion, but a covert intellectual rebellion against the very institutions that controlled knowledge and belief? Leonardo da Vinci didn't trust the world with his ideas. That's not just a matter of speculation, it's a documented fact. If we look at the surviving manuscripts of his notebooks, we see a clear pattern. Nearly all of them are written in mirror script, a backward handwriting that can only be read when reflected in a mirror. This choice of writing, one that can only be deciphered under specific conditions, speaks to Leonardo's desire for secrecy. The question remains, was this just a convenience for a left-handed man, or was it a deliberate act of concealment? The answer is likely the latter. Leonardo's notebooks weren't just reversed. They were filled with coded abbreviations, invented shorthand, and complex diagrams. Even the drawings were layered with hidden geometry, symbolic references, and encoded messages that scholars are still trying to understand today. He buried his ideas the way others might lock doors secure, hidden, protected. This need for secrecy was not without cause. Leonardo lived in a time when the Catholic Church wielded tremendous influence over knowledge, belief, and public expression. Independent thought, especially if it questioned scripture or the divine authority of the Church, was considered not only controversial but dangerous. Galileo, a century after Leonardo, was placed under house arrest for proposing the heliocentric model of the solar system. Giordano Bruno was executed for his radical ideas. Leonardo, who was already under suspicion for his unconventional lifestyle and relentless curiosity, knew the risks. He understood that to voice his true thoughts openly could lead to severe consequences, perhaps even death. So, instead of speaking aloud, he encoded his thoughts. He turned to art, to painting, to secretive methods of communicating his deeper beliefs. And in his most famous work, The Last Supper, he wove these thoughts into the very fabric of the painting, hiding them in plain sight for centuries. When Leonardo began work on The Last Supper in 1495, he made a decision that baffled his contemporaries. Instead of using the traditional buon fresco technique where pigment is applied to wet plaster, which bonds permanently, Leonardo experimented with his own method, using oil and tempera on dry plaster. This new technique allowed him to achieve finer details, richer colors, and more depth in his work. However, the trade-off was that the paint began to deteriorate almost immediately. Within just a few decades, the mural was already flaking. Most art historians have considered this a failure, a decision that ultimately led to the painting's physical degradation. But what they failed to recognize is that Leonardo's technique created something a traditional fresco could never achieve: layers of paint, one on top of another, where markings on lower surfaces could remain completely hidden. These layers, seemingly accidental in their deterioration, became the perfect hiding places for secrets. What Leonardo had done was to create a painting that, over time, would reveal its true meaning if only the right tools and knowledge were available to uncover it. The question, of course, is whether this was intentional or a happy accident. But given the precision with which Leonardo approached every aspect of his work, the idea that this layering technique was unintentional seems unlikely. In fact, what Leonardo did was create a system that would allow him to encode a message in his painting, which could only be revealed by technology that would not exist for centuries. The Last Supper wasn't just a painting, it was a puzzle, a cryptic message for those with the right tools and the right time. For over 5 centuries, The Last Supper was examined, restored, admired, and analyzed. Scholars, art critics, and scientists pored over every detail, yet no one had uncovered what lay beneath the surface. It wasn't until the advent of modern technology, specifically AI and high-resolution scanning techniques, that the secret hidden within the painting began to come to light. Researchers began to apply AI to high-resolution scans of The Last Supper. At first, the system found nothing remarkable, just the usual patterns of plaster degradation, minor cracks, and the natural aging of the paint. But then, something strange happened. On day 19 of the scan, the system flagged an anomaly. A cluster of faint markings behind the figure of Jesus. The markings weren't random cracks in the plaster or faded brushstrokes. They seemed deliberate, intentional. The system tagged them with 67% certainty that they were intentional script, not merely the product of natural decay. At first, the team was skeptical. "That's just mineral deposits," said Marco Ferretti, the senior imaging specialist. "It's nothing." But Dr. Rossi, the lead researcher, disagreed. She compared the markings to Leonardo's known mirror script from the Codex Arundel. The similarities were uncanny. The curves, the spacing, the regularity. This wasn't just wear and tear from the painting's age. These markings had been intentionally placed. Over the following weeks, the AI continued its work, processing more areas of the mural. The more it analyzed, the more the hidden script began to emerge. In the shadowed areas beneath the table, in the folds of the disciples' robes, and in the stone arches, the same type of markings began to appear, always in the same dark, unnoticed areas. The AI's confidence score climbed steadily, and the words began to resolve. As the AI continued processing the high-resolution scans, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Each analysis took the machine deeper into the layers of the painting, into areas previously dismissed as insignificant. The more the AI examined the composition, the more it uncovered a series of markings that seemed to emerge from the dark corners of the canvas, away from the focus of the light. This wasn't random. This was a hidden message, encoded with precision by the artist himself. Rossi and her team watched in awe as the markings began to take form, They weren't simply abstract shapes or flaws in the paint. They were individual letters, words, and phrases that were unmistakably intentional. The team was stunned. These words, so carefully concealed, so deeply embedded within the layers of the Last Supper, had remained undetected for centuries. What did they mean? Why had Leonardo chosen this method of communication? And, most importantly, why had these words remained hidden until now? At first, the words appeared isolated, scattered across the surface of the painting. But as the AI continued its analysis, the words began to connect. Short phrases emerged, then longer ones. What was truly remarkable was the pattern that began to take shape, one that followed a spiraling path, starting near Jesus' right hand and expanding outward, passing across the disciples in a sequence. This was not a haphazard arrangement. It was deliberate, and it followed a pattern known as the golden ratio, a mathematical principle that Leonardo used obsessively throughout his artistic work. The placement of the words was not random. It was methodical. Every letter, every word, every phrase was architecturally woven into the fabric of the composition. The spiral pattern, one of Leonardo's most beloved principles, guided the message, allowing it to emerge from the very heart of the painting, spiraling outward. Just as the truth would gradually unfold for those with the knowledge and the tools to see it. The first coherent phrase appeared along the wall directly behind Jesus. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably present. When translated from Leonardo's archaic Florentine dialect, it read, "All faith fades when light reveals the hand of man." For a moment, the room fell silent. Rossi read it aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't just a philosophical statement. It was a challenge to the very foundation of religious belief. The phrase suggested that what people revered as divine might, in fact, be a human creation. Faith, it implied, could dissolve under scrutiny, when the light of reason revealed the true nature of things. The implications were enormous. Here, hidden in plain sight, in one of the most famous religious paintings of all time, Leonardo was presenting an idea that was radical, dangerous, and ahead of its time. This was not just a devotional artwork, it was a covert message that called into question the very nature of faith. Rossi's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the discovery. She had spent years studying Leonardo's work, advocating for the idea that his art contained layers of meaning that had been overlooked by scholars for centuries. Now, standing before this monumental revelation, she understood that her work had been validated. Leonardo had indeed embedded a secret message, one that had been hidden for 500 years. But this was just the beginning. The second phrase appeared near the shadowed figure of Judas Iscariot, the disciple who would betray Christ. It read, "He who eats with truth will not betray himself." The words seemed to reframe Judas's identity, suggesting that betrayal was not inherent, but a product of the mind and the choices we make. Judas, in this interpretation, wasn't a simple villain, but a figure trapped in his own actions, like all humans. It was a message of redemption, of responsibility, and of choice. Then, the third phrase surfaced, beneath Peter. "Strength without understanding is blind." This was a subtle yet powerful critique of power without wisdom. The idea that one could possess strength without the ability to understand its true nature was a warning against unchecked authority. The implication was clear: without understanding, strength becomes a destructive force. And near Thomas, the apostle who famously doubted the resurrection of Christ, the AI uncovered a fourth phrase. To question is not sin, but the path to clarity. This was a profound statement. It suggested that doubt, far from being a sin, was a necessary part of the human condition. To question, to seek clarity, was a noble pursuit, not one to be punished, but one to be embraced. Each phrase was tied to a specific disciple, reinterpreting their biblical roles through a lens of reason, skepticism, and intellectual inquiry. What Leonardo was embedding in his painting wasn't just a message about religion. It was a philosophical framework, one that valued reason and intellectual exploration over blind faith. These messages weren't merely theological reflections, they were challenges to the very foundations of institutional belief. Leonardo, in his hidden message, was embedding a philosophical framework that valued inquiry over obedience, skepticism over unquestioning faith. And what's most striking is that these ideas would not become widely accepted until the Enlightenment, a full 250 years later. Leonardo wasn't just ahead of his time, he was outside of it entirely. What most people don't realize is that the idea that human reason should stand alongside, or even above, institutional authority, would not become mainstream European thought for another 2.5 centuries. Leonardo's work, hidden beneath the surface of the Last Supper, was revolutionary, an intellectual rebellion against the very institutions that governed thought during his time. And this idea of human reason standing beside faith would later be celebrated during the Enlightenment, where thinkers like Descartes and Kant would embrace the idea of reason as a guiding force in human affairs. But Leonardo had already planted the seed. His message had been waiting to be discovered, waiting for a world that was ready to understand it. As more phrases began to surface, the implications grew even larger. These weren't just isolated thoughts scattered throughout the painting. They were part of a unified message, a coherent narrative that reinterpreted the very nature of faith and reason. The AI was not just uncovering hidden words, it was revealing a deeply embedded critique of the very systems that governed the world during Leonardo's time. The most profound discovery came when the AI uncovered the final phrase, buried in the lower right section of the mural. It read, "Those who hold power will bury truth beneath stone until the eyes of the future uncover it." This wasn't just philosophy, it was a direct accusation. It suggested that the institutions that controlled knowledge, power, and belief had deliberately concealed the truth to maintain their authority. And it was not a message meant for Leonardo's contemporaries. It was aimed directly at us, those in the future who would one day have the tools to uncover the truth buried beneath the layers of history. This phrase was more than just a warning. It was a challenge to the institutions that sought to suppress knowledge. It was a call to action, a reminder that truth cannot be buried forever. The eyes of the future would eventually uncover it. As the AI processed more and more sections of the painting, the messages began to connect. The fragmented phrases formed a cohesive statement, and when viewed in sequence, they created a unified declaration, a powerful statement that encapsulated Leonardo's hidden message. The final message, when all the pieces were pieced together, read, "Faith without reason is the sleep of truth, and those who wake shall see what was forbidden." This statement was the culmination of everything Leonardo had hidden in his painting. It was a profound critique of faith and reason, a challenge to the institutions that sought to control knowledge, and a call to arms for those who would dare to seek the truth. Rossi, reading the final message aloud, felt a sense of exhilaration, mixed with disbelief. She had spent years studying Leonardo's work, searching for clues, following leads that many had dismissed as fanciful. Now, standing before this monumental discovery, she knew that her career had been vindicated. But what had begun as a scientific endeavor had turned into something far more profound. She wasn't just uncovering hidden meanings in a painting. She was unlocking a message that would change the way the world saw the Last Supper, and perhaps the world itself. When the findings went public, they caused an immediate and intense reaction. Scholars, theologians, and art critics debated the implications. Some saw it as a groundbreaking revelation, a discovery that fundamentally changed the way we understand Leonardo and the Last Supper. Others dismissed it as a speculative interpretation, driven by technology, rather than true historical evidence. The Vatican, wary of the potential fallout, issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging the technological breakthrough, but cautioning against hasty conclusions. In Milan, protests erupted. Some demanded that the full scans be released to the public, while others, mostly religious groups, argued that the sanctity of the painting should not be disturbed. The online reaction was just as intense. The hashtag number Da Vinci Decoded trended globally, sparking debates about the true meaning of the Last Supper, about faith, reason, and the role of the Church in shaping history. Some conspiracy theorists claimed that the hidden messages were proof of a secret society within the Catholic Church, while atheists celebrated the discovery as proof that the greatest minds in history had always doubted organized religion. Weeks passed, and the debate continued to rage. But for Dr. Rossi, the real moment of understanding came when she stood before the Last Supper itself. In the quiet of the refectory at Santa Maria della Grazia, she found herself staring at the very wall where the AI had uncovered the hidden messages. The paint was old, cracked, and faded, but it still radiated a strange magnetic energy. She knew in that moment that Leonardo had not painted for his contemporaries. He had painted for the future, for the day when the world would have eyes sharp enough to uncover his secrets. As the debate around the discovery spread, the implications of this hidden message in the Last Supper began to resonate beyond the art world. For centuries, art had been considered a reflection of the artist's skill, imagination, and, often, their devotion to the divine. Religious paintings like the Last Supper were, at the time, considered sacred texts in their own right. But what if Leonardo's genius lay not only in his technical mastery, but in his ability to use art itself as a vehicle for hidden thought, a tool of intellectual subversion? The traditional view of art as merely a representation of religious themes was forever altered by this revelation. The Last Supper, a painting often described as the quintessential image of Christ's final moments, was not only a religious commission, but also an intellectual battleground. It was as if Leonardo had used his position as an artist within the church's patronage to weave a covert critique of the very institution that funded him. What's even more astonishing is that Leonardo knew this would only come to light centuries after his death. He had no guarantee that his secret messages would be uncovered in his lifetime or in the lifetimes of his direct descendants. He didn't paint for the Duke of Milan, who commissioned the work, nor did he paint for the monks who would sit beneath it and perform their duties. Leonardo painted for the future. He painted for the moment when humanity's intellect and technology would evolve to a point where his coded thoughts could be decoded. And, most importantly, he painted for the moment when the world would be able to look at his work and recognize the hidden truths he left for us. In a time when thinkers and scientists were silenced by the might of the Catholic Church, Leonardo's decision to hide his ideas in the very medium that defined his legacy was both brilliant and dangerous. Art, he believed, was a perfect medium for his subversive messages. A painting could pass unnoticed by those who were meant to keep control of knowledge, but it would still be powerful enough to communicate a message to those with the wisdom to uncover it. By embedding these ideas into the work itself, Leonardo protected his thoughts, while simultaneously challenging the very institutions that held power over knowledge. When the AI analysis began to reveal the first fragments of the hidden message, it was clear that this was not a simple case of discovering forgotten sketches or overlooked brushstrokes. The message embedded in the Last Supper was a philosophical and intellectual framework built upon the most radical ideas of the time. It was a complete shift in the way we understand both Leonardo and the era in which he lived. The AI was programmed to detect patterns not only in the visual details of the painting, but also in the more abstract elements, such as the geometrical structure and hidden shapes. With the ability to examine the painting's layers at an unprecedented level of detail, the system was able to detect the faintest of markings, marks that no human could have identified through traditional methods. These hidden symbols were part of the structure of the painting, woven into the very fabric of the mural. At first, it seemed like a long shot. The idea that the Last Supper could contain an intentional message hidden beneath its visible surface seemed, to many, like an impossibility. But the technology was clear. What had once been invisible, what had been dismissed as cracks in the paint, or the normal deterioration of time, now emerged as deliberate, intentional markings, each word, each phrase, carefully placed, part of a larger secret. For the researchers involved in the analysis, the breakthrough was overwhelming. The AI not only detected these hidden words, but it also revealed how they were structurally connected. The markings, it seemed, followed a mathematical pattern, the golden ratio, one that Leonardo had employed in many of his works. This revelation was staggering, because it meant that the hidden messages weren't just randomly placed, they were part of the very structure of the painting. As the team continued to study the layers of paint, they discovered that the words followed a spiral pattern, starting from the figure of Jesus and spiraling outward, crossing each disciple in sequence. This was no coincidence. Leonardo's use of the golden ratio was well documented in his other works, and the fact that the same principle appeared here reinforced the idea that these markings were not random. They were part of a master plan, an intellectual rebellion encoded into the very architecture of the painting. As the AI continued to decode the hidden messages, the first fully coherent phrase emerged from the shadows behind Jesus. When translated from Leonardo's archaic Florentine dialect, it read, "All faith fades when light reveals the hand of man." The room was silent. Rossi, the lead researcher, read the words aloud, her voice trembling. It wasn't just a thought, it was a challenge to the very foundation of religious belief, a questioning of the divine, a suggestion that what was revered as holy could, in fact, be a human creation. This was not the message of a devout Christian. It was the message of a thinker who sought to separate faith from reason, to place humanity at the center of its own inquiry. This wasn't just art, it was an intellectual challenge to the centuries of dogma that had defined the age. The implications were immediate and profound. Here, in one of the most famous religious paintings of all time, was a message that seemed to undermine the very concept of divine authority. The Last Supper, A work long understood as a representation of Christian sacrifice was now being seen as something entirely different. It was not just a moment of religious devotion, it was a covert act of rebellion, one that would not have been understood or accepted in Leonardo's time. For the first time in history, the world was looking at the Last Supper through a completely new lens. The painting, once viewed as a simple depiction of Christ's final meal, was now being understood as a work that contained a radical critique of the religious institutions of its time. And this was just the first message. There was more to uncover, and the world was eager to see what would come next. As the AI delved deeper into the composition, more messages began to emerge. The next phrase appeared near Judas, the infamous betrayer of Christ. He who eats with truth will not betray himself. This was a significant reinterpretation of Judas's role in the narrative. In traditional interpretations, Judas was the ultimate villain, the one who would betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But in Leonardo's hidden message, Judas wasn't portrayed as inherently evil. Instead, the phrase suggested that betrayal was not a simple act of evil, but a consequence of misunderstanding or ignorance. This was a call for personal responsibility, an invitation to recognize the complexities of human nature and the consequences of our actions. The next message appeared beneath Peter. Strength without understanding is blind. This phrase was a profound critique of unchecked power. Strength, in this context, was not a virtue unless it was accompanied by understanding. Power, without wisdom, becomes dangerous. It becomes a force of destruction, not creation. This message suggested that true strength lies in the ability to reason, to understand, and to question the world around us. Then, near Thomas, the apostle famous for his doubts about the resurrection, the AI uncovered. To question is not sin, but the path to clarity. This was the most radical message yet. It suggested that doubt, far from being a sin, was an essential part of the human experience. It was not only acceptable to question, but it was necessary. Doubt was the path to clarity, the road to deeper understanding. This was a direct challenge to the notion of blind faith, and it placed intellectual inquiry at the forefront of Leonardo's philosophy. Each phrase, as it appeared, reframed the biblical identities of the disciples. They were no longer static symbols of religious dogma. They were now dynamic figures, each one struggling with ideas of faith, strength, betrayal, and truth. Leonardo, it seemed, had embedded a complete philosophical framework into the painting itself, one that valued reason, inquiry, and skepticism over obedience and unquestioning faith. Leonardo's hidden messages weren't just critiques of religion, they were critiques of authority itself. They questioned not only the divine but also the very institutions that sought to control knowledge, power, and belief. What Leonardo had embedded into the Last Supper was not just an intellectual challenge, it was a revolutionary manifesto, one that placed reason and skepticism above faith. And yet, despite the radical nature of these ideas, they were buried beneath layers of paint, invisible to all but the sharpest minds and the most advanced technology. Leonardo, it seemed, had understood that his message would never be understood in his own time. He knew that the world wasn't ready for these ideas, and so he hid them away in his art, ensuring that they would survive until the time was right. The ideas expressed in these hidden phrases were not new, at least not in the grand arc of human thought. The idea that reason and inquiry should stand alongside, or even above, institutional authority would not become mainstream until the Enlightenment, more than 2 centuries later. Leonardo, however, was already there. He had seen the potential of human reason, and he had placed his faith in it, rather than in the institutions of his time.